Hello everyone, and welcome back to the final video in my multi-part micro-series about understanding and breaking down propaganda. Now, the idea for this video series came from a comment that was left on one of my earlier videos asking if I could break down or explain some of these concepts. So if there are additional concepts related to propaganda that I didn't cover in this series that you were hoping that I would, please feel free to drop them down below or send them to me in a message. Beyond that, if there are videos around any topic, around government or civics or social justice or anything that you see a lot in the media that you want to understand better or more information about, drop those too, because now I'm looking for what to do for my next series. In the final video today, I want to talk about something that I think is really important and something that I think that many of you have probably been asking yourself about over the last couple of years. And that is how to help a loved one when they are really being influenced by propaganda. In the hyper-polarized, emotionally charged political climate that we're living in, lots of people have fallen prey on all sides of the political aisle to manipulation and propaganda. To help someone realize that they've been influenced by propaganda requires compassion, patience, strategy, and a clear understanding of why propaganda works in the first place. The original question I was asked was, how do you help someone who is only getting their news from sources of misinformation? And I felt like I couldn't even accurately answer that question or give advice until I went through all the different forms of propaganda and how they're used, so you can really see how people are able to fall for these things. It's not about being smart or dumb. It's about media literacy. It's about being able to recognize when you're being manipulated. And the whole point of being manipulated is manipulation. You're not supposed to be able to tell it's happening. So instead of judging people who have fallen victim to propaganda, we need to consider, why were they so willing to believe it in the first place? I want to share some trauma-informed approaches that can help disarm defensiveness and foster critical thinking when you're talking to someone about propaganda. So the first step is to understand why they believe it. Again, people fall for propaganda not necessarily because they're stupid or uneducated, but because it validates their fear, their pain, or their values. It often feels like the truth, even if it isn't, and it is repeated constantly and framed emotionally. So you should try to approach with empathy. I can see why that message might feel true to you, especially because you've experienced X thing. Can we talk about that a little more? The second thing is to avoid shame, mockery, or facts-first knowledge. You want to avoid phrases like, "you've been brainwashed," or "that's obviously fake," or "how can you believe this crap," or "are you stupid?" These trigger shame, and they solidify someone's belief, especially if they've entered into those beliefs because they feel isolated, or they feel like they've been pushed out of other groups. When you come behind that feeling and say, hey, you don't belong because you're dumb and you've been brainwashed, all it does is push them further and further into that group. That's how outsider culture works, for better and for worse. So instead of shaming or mockery or even leading with, "this is the fact, why don't you understand that?" try saying, "that's a really interesting point. I've seen some really different information though. Can I share that with you?" The third thing is to ask curiosity-based questions. Use open-ended, non-judgmental questions to encourage the other person to think critically without confrontation, and disrupt their automatic belief systems. So examples of questions like that would be, "where did you first hear that?" Or "how did you find that source?" Or "how did you know that source is trustworthy?" And "what would it take for you to question if that idea were true?" Or "do you think people from the other side ever feel like they're also being manipulated?" The purpose and the point is to show the other person that you're curious about where their worldview comes from. When I used to do bridge building work with different groups of people or manage conflict between different groups of people when I was in social justice work, one of the things that I would often try to do is, instead of automatically shaming, judging, or being upset by someone's perspective, trying to consider what might have happened to them in their life that they developed that perspective. What are the things that they've been taught, and what are the things that they have to unlearn? From there, I was able to come up with a plan or a theory of change for how I would approach their specific point of view when talking about these issues. When I had to combat resistance from CEOs or boards of directors or whoever I was trying to get work past when I was a consultant, I had to do the same thing. It was about coming up with the common ground we had and then figuring out where that split happened in our lives that took us on completely different ideological journeys. The next tactic is name the tactic, not the person. So talk about the method of propaganda that's being used, not the intelligence or the motives behind it. You can say something like, "Oh, that slogan is just a classic example of a glittering generality. It sounds so good, but it's not really saying anything." Or you can say, "Oh, that post is really using fear and blame to create a sense of fake urgency. Don't you hate when they use that technique to try to confuse you?" What you want to do is call out the tactic of propaganda that's being used versus calling out that person for having a response to it. Next is to use analogies and personal stories. Frame it in terms that they can relate to, whether that means talking about sports or relationships or religion. I like to use workplace experiences. For example, have you ever had a boss guilt you into doing something that just didn't feel fair? Well, that's what propaganda does. It's playing on your loyalty. And I know you to be someone who really has a problem with authority. So I'm really shocked that you believe this. The next one is to introduce counter narratives slowly. Use trusted, nonpartisan, or emotionally neutral sources when possible. I know we're in a time where everyone is extremely upset that a lot of mainstream media entities and journalists are being unbiased. They're remaining in a space where they're reporting on the facts of the news and not giving their opinion on it. And sometimes that can upset people. When we're seeing atrocity happen, we want it to be called out. But these sources are critically important when you're trying to provide counter narratives to someone who has been brainwashed. They need to see emotionally neutral, fact-based information that's not written by someone on the left or the right. That neutrality really matters when it comes to breaking down a counter agenda. You should also share your alternative perspectives as additions, not a replacement. So instead of thinking this, you should think that. You want to say something like, I saw this really great breakdown about that from a veteran who thinks really differently, and it really made me think. I'd love to share that with you. The next is equip, don't convert, and this feeds back a little into the last one. Instead of just trying to debunk someone's information or show them how they've been misled or how inaccurate something is, you can offer other media literacy tools, things like mediabiasfactcheck.com or reachright.org, which has a great media bias chart I've shared with you before, things like Snopes, Political Fact, and AP Fact Check. But again, you don't just want to shove the information at them and say, this is the right information, look at this instead. You want to share it as a tool for how they can then look up the information they're reading and see if other people are saying it's true. Next, you want to prioritize the relationship, and this is really hard. I have removed people from my life because of ideological differences that we could just not see eye to eye about, and that's okay. But you need to remember that people really change beliefs unless they feel psychologically safe. So you have to maintain that connection even if you disagree. If you truly value that person and that relationship, you have to keep making that effort to break through. They may come back to what you said later once they feel safe to do so or have had time to reflect on their own. Just because they don't immediately change sides or change their mind doesn't necessarily mean you should give up. You have to remember you're trying to undo intense, intentional levels of psychological manipulation that are coming at them from every angle and from sources that they're being told are authorities. Next, use yes and instead of no but. And this goes into what we talked about before. Instead of saying, no, that's not true, say, yes, I've seen that view, but I've also read this alternative information. And then lastly, recognize trauma and identity defenses. Political propaganda attaches to identity. When you challenge the belief, people feel like you're attacking them. So reframe that by separating the person from the belief. I hope this helped.